Here. Welcome. My name is Craig Cornu. I work with the Institute for Applied Ecology. I live in Coos Bay. And I serve as the project lead for both of the projects that we're going to be talking about today. I also coordinate the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, so we'll talk a little bit about that. I hope you've all had a chance to settle in, grab a little bit of coffee and snacks. Feel free to keep noshing as we get underway. I wanted to start by thanking the Tulalip tribes very much for offering their spectacular facilities here for us to meet. We met here last winter. Yeah, January, and this is just a really nice place to have these kinds of meetings. So anyway, thank you guys very much. Just a couple quick notes on logistics. There is a sign-in sheet out in the lobby there that hopefully most of you have seen. So please sign in if you haven't already done so. Likewise with name tags, if you can fill out your name tags, that would be great. Many of you probably already know that the restrooms are out down the hallway through the lobby, etc. Anything else about the room I need to go over? Okay. Probably noticed that there's people in the back here video recording the workshop. So we want to be able to share these proceedings with a bunch of people who aren't able to make it here to participate. So that means that when we talk, we're going to need to have a microphone in front of us or talk really loud, I guess. So for presenters, it's not a problem because obviously there's a mic right here, but we do have two wireless mics that will pass around. So if you want to talk, get the eye of the person who's got the microphone. And what we'll try to do is turn them on and off. There's a button there. Turn them off when they're not being used. So we'll just have to see how this goes. And apparently there's a little bit of a delay when you turn it on, so wait for the little green button, as I'm told. Okay. So today we're going to be hearing about and discussing the results of two very much related blue carbon projects. And both of these projects are going to be wrapping up at the end of the year. So we've got some results to report. And that means that we're also going to be we're going to want to talk about next steps for blue carbon in the Pacific Northwest. So we'll have a session at the end about that. So before I do a quick hit on the agenda and we get into introductions, that's the time you'll be able to practice using the microphones. I wanted to quickly set the stage and give you some background on these two projects, just to make sure that we're all on the same bus and you can see how they relate to each other. Last time we met in this room, we were just talking about one of these projects. So first, as many of you know, these are both projects that are implemented by the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group. And it's that's a group that was formed in about 2014, largely in response to the verified carbon standards blue carbon methodology for tidal wetland restoration. And the working group takes a collaborative approach to collecting blue carbon data needed to make use of that methodology. So you're about to hear a lot more about that methodology. And the group, as it says here on the slide, it's a group of scientists, resource managers, et cetera. So the idea is that we wanted everyone to get together to work on filling data gaps collaboratively, so we're not falling all over each other, competing for the same grants. And the working group even has a website and a Twitter handle, or whatever you call it. So Chris Janicek is the guy who set that up, and I think Chris is the main contributor, but I guess anyone is welcome to do that. I'm afraid of it myself, so it's there, and it's a good thing. So the overall goal of the working group is essentially to facilitate the development of blue carbon projects in our region, so we can add tidal wetland restoration to regional climate change mitigation actions. And to that end, the working group developed a research framework that includes both biophysical and socioeconomic research objectives. And that framework is what we did back in 2015. And so armed with that research framework and the associated objectives and the group's collaborative approach, we started to develop research proposals to fill these data gaps. And in 2016, we received funding from the Near Science Collaborative for the first of the two projects that we'll be talking about today, which is the Pacific Northwest Carbon Stocks Assessment and Database Development Project. It actually has a much longer name than that. That's the shorter version. So that project was designed to address especially these objectives that are in our research framework, and we'll be getting into that project today. And so here's a quick snapshot of that 3-year project, and again, you're going to hear a lot more about that today. So we have a heck of a lot of partners, we have a lot of objectives, and we have a lot of sites to talk about. So I don't want to steal the thunder of later presenters. So the way we set this up is the first project, the first data gap that we wanted to address out of the chute was carbon stocks, and the other two major data gaps, which have to do with greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration rates, we're leaving those to subsequent proposals. So just so you know that we considered this project the first in a 3-step or maybe 2 or 3-step project. So that project got going in 2016, and as that was moving along, not to be overshadowed by that project, in 2018, the working group went back to the Near Science Collaborative and proposed a 1-year carbon finance feasibility assessment. And the idea there was that project would take advantage of the new data being collected by the Carbon Stocks Project and existing data that are now included in this database that is being developed by that same project. And so the feasibility assessment is designed to essentially address those research framework objectives. And here's a quick snapshot of this 1-year assessment, and you're about to hear a lot more about that. So lots of people, again, lots of objectives, but fewer sites. So the idea behind this assessment, this feasibility assessment, was to give end users that are involved in both projects an early peek at how blue carbon valuation works and how blue carbon projects might unfold in the Pacific Northwest, while exposing any remaining data gaps that we might have or other issues that need to be resolved before we can make those blue carbon projects happen here. So lumped together, we've got the carbon stocks and database project here, starting in November 2016, ending December. Same thing with the feasibility assessment project, the one-year project. Here we are in October, somewhere around here, so we just have a little blip left on these projects, which is a little overwhelming. So it needs to be noted here that both projects have been undertaken with the invaluable participation of a long list of project team members who have been guided by the perspectives and needs of an equally long list of end users, you guys. And it's all facilitated by, in this case, two National Estuary Research reserves in the system, which is Padilla Bay or Padilla Bay up in Padilla Bay, and South Slough down in Coos Bay. And so without the reserve's key participation here, these projects don't happen. So I just want to make sure that everyone is clear about that. And it goes without saying that the Near Science Collaborative funding, guidance, and support resources have been really, really helpful and excellent too. So let's quickly go over the agenda here. And it's pretty simple. You'll note the details here, but I'm just going to do morning. We're going to be jumping right into the feasibility assessment with that team, describing what the results are and associated issues. There's a break in there, and then more of that before lunch. We're going to have lunch right here. It will be delivered here, so we can eat right here. Then in the afternoon, we're going to talk about the carbon stocks and database project with a break, and then on into the afternoon, and then I'm going to come back and talk about next steps and et cetera, and then we'll wrap up by about 4:30, 4:45. Any questions before we get to introductions? Okay, so here's your here's your big chance to use the microphones. Amy.
Amy Bordy, Pacific Northwest National Labs.
Heide Diefendorfer, also Pacific Northwest National Labs. I'm part of the Blue Carbon Stocks project, as is Amy.
Chris Janisek with Oregon State.
Schile-Beers with Silvestrum Climate Associates.
Steve Crooks. I'm an member on the Big Science Project and one of the leads on the feasibility assessment from Silvestrum.
Mark Stamey, ICF Jones and Stokes. I'm a local restoration ecologist.
Roger Fuller. I'm with Padilla Bay National Estuary Research Reserve.
Hey everyone, Jude Apple, the director at Padilla Bay National Estuary Research Reserve, and I've been on both of these projects of the Blue Carbon Working Group since the beginning.
Ron Thom, Pacific Northwest National Lab, retired.
Good morning, Kirsten Feifel with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources.
We can keep that microphone over there, and then we'll start with Scott. Thanks, Kirsten.
Good morning, I'm Scott Suttlemeyer. It's working. I'm with Terra Carbon, and I'm part of the team that worked on the carbon project feasibility assessment.
I'm Steve Emmett-Mattox. I'm with Strategic Collaborations and also part-time with Restore America's Estuaries and part of the team on the feasibility work.
Ben Lubbers, Tulalip Tribes Planning Department.
Stephen Fry, Seattle 2030 District.
Good morning, everyone. Erin Meyer with the Seattle Aquarium.
Hi, I'm Pipo Bui with Earth Corps, and we're a young adult conservation corps and a local member of Restore America's Estuaries. We were involved in the original field demonstration project, saying that right? And maybe you know it, our blue carbon video.
Hard to follow. Wolf Lichtenstein with Evergreen Carbon. I do work in carbon markets and auditing and assessment work.
I'm Kyler Sherry with the Climate Trust. We finance and invest in carbon offset projects.
I'm Jamie Robertson with the Nature Conservancy.
I'm Molly Bogenberg, and I'm also with the Nature Conservancy.
Good morning. I'm Mike Reste. I work for Snohomish County, and I'm heavily involved in salmon recovery efforts here in the Snohomish Basin.
Good morning. I'm Kurt Nelson. I'm with the Tulalip Tribes. I work as their Environmental Division Manager.
Hello, I'm Lucas Ravens. I work for Tulalip Shellfish.
And I'm Phil North, and I am the Climate Adaptation Coordinator for Tulalip.
I'm Aaron Jones, the Treaty Rights Protection Specialist. I work for this guy too.
Leanne Burke, Tulalip Tribes Planning.
Hi, I'm David Grover. I work here in Tulalip's Natural Resource Department.
Excuse me, I'm Valerie Streeter, and I'm the Stormwater Planner at Tulalip Tribes.
Colin Wall, I'm an environmental scientist in the Treaty Rights Office, working on salmon recovery issues.
Hi, I'm Erin Murray. I work with the Puget Sound Partnership.
I'm Lindsay Desmond. I work for Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I work closely with our Nearshore program.
I'm Lizzie Stone, and I'm a student with the University of Washington.
Hello, I'm Boone Kaufman from the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University.
Hi, I'm Morgan Ruff with Tulalip Tribes.
Okay, great. If you can turn that mic off and just hang on to it, that would be great. A little went over, so apologies to Steve. So let's move on to the next session.
Where's the mouse?
All right.
Good morning. Oh, I got to stand here. Good morning. Really glad to see such a great turnout. And as Craig mentioned, the last time we were here, we were just introducing this idea of doing blue carbon finance feasibility for tidal wetland restoration in the Snohomish estuary in particular. I think that was a really informative meeting for our team. And since you've last seen us, in particular, Scott, Steve, and Lisa have been using their brains a lot to basically do the analysis and figure out what questions we can answer, where there are uncertainties, what directions we want to be heading in terms of our understanding of blue carbon and blue carbon finance here in the Northwest. In general, and I'm just going to say a few things to kind of remind you of the context. Some of you were here at that meeting last January, some of you were not. And so just to get us all on the same platform, our blue carbon strategy for a long time, and some of us have been at this for 10 years now, trying to really connecting improved science and quantification, so the data, to support enhanced policies, improved management strategies, new financial opportunities, including carbon markets, but not necessarily limited to carbon markets. And then, all of that can be supported by or added to persuasive advocacy and communications. In one way, what we're trying to do is build a portfolio of our understanding of carbon management in coastal wetlands. And this is the most recent place we've done that in the U.S. We've also been involved in projects on Cape Cod at the largest restoration in that area called the Herring River Restoration, and then also down in Rookery Bay, Florida at the Fruit Farm Creek Restoration, and that's a mangrove project. So everywhere we focus on this, we're really adding to that portfolio of our knowledge and learning more about, about where this could be possible in the landscape, and even if not possible from a market perspective, what are the greenhouse gas benefits of protecting and restoring these ecosystems? A little bit just for context, and we could just spend a day on everything that's going on and all the advances we've made in blue carbon in the last 10 years. That's a different day, that's not today. But first thing just to acknowledge again for the context is that the U.S. was the first country to include blue carbon ecosystems, salt marshes, tidal wetlands, mangroves, in their national greenhouse gas accounting. And this happened for the 2016 report, and it was done again in 17 or 18, I think? Every year, and it's being done every year. Steve is a big part of that. And so first country to do that, following IPCC guidelines. And projects like this one, and when I say projects, I mean both of them, so the feasibility work and all the science that supports it, really help refine those quantifications. They can happen at a high level, but the more we can get down into the details, the more accurate it will become, and the more we can make informed management decisions. Secondly, and this was referenced a little bit by Craig, but there are two methodologies, and these are the tools you need in order to do offset projects in coastal wetlands and to get credits for that. And the first one is VM33. That's under the Verified Carbon Standard, and that's for tidal, wetland, and seagrass restoration. And then the second one, which is very close to being approved, but still has a few months to go, is VM33, and that is for tidal, wetland, and seagrass conservation, so protection activities. It will also wrap in some of the restoration activities, so if you're doing projects that would both protect and restore ecosystems, that would be the one to use. It's more comprehensive. And so that's coming online real soon, and that helps. Scott will talk a little bit about it, I think, when he's talking about the market piece and the feasibility of doing blue carbon finance here in the Northwest. But those are what make it possible to do that. The third thing I just want to highlight is the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network. And this was an initiative started a few years ago. A group of scientists and nonprofits who were very interested in basically better orchestrating, collaborating on, and synthesizing the data that's being generated in these blue carbon ecosystems. So not just carbon, but greenhouse gases. And so this now exists. It's not the big graphic on the left, that's a book. I'll talk about that in a moment. But if you just Google Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network, it comes right up. It's housed at the Smithsonian institution, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Maryland. And it's a great place if you're developing data, if you want to start exploring what data is out there. Its goal is to be a clearinghouse for this. So that's another piece of the puzzle, and I think that'll be talked about a little bit this afternoon when they talk about the stocks, the data they're getting from the Carbon Stocks Project and what happens with that data, right? You guys will touch on that? Okay. And then last, there are so many publications that, and really the best way to find those is to probably Google on blue carbon ecosystems at a global scale, national scales, regional scales, local scales, cores, stock, sequestration data, analyses, up and down the ladder, really, and there's more and more publications, every month. And that's really exciting. And rather than list all of them, I just thought I would instead just highlight the fact that there's a book. And it's a really fantastic book with a lot of great authors, and covering basically all aspects of blue carbon, from policy and management to science, quantification, all of it. So that would be a place to go for one, like a single resource. And a good starting point for that. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'm going to have to stop opening and closing this door. So Craig threw this up earlier. We also have objective and outcomes, hey, yay. And I just wanted, though, to remind you of particularly the objective of doing the carbon finance feasibility work here in the Snohomish and the other 2 locations where we worked, was to demonstrate the feasibility of connecting carbon finance to tidal wetland restoration projects. And so that's what we were specifically tasked to do. And there's a lot of great things that come out of that. So, throughout we've been engaging the local communities in terms of data, ideas, input, reviews. You guys have been a fantastic resource and also helped guide where we've gone with this work. Looking at the economic viability, Scott will be talking about that. Information, science, data gaps, and how to approach those. We'll be talking about that later this morning. And then roadmaps. So where is blue carbon finance possible in the Northwest? How do we get there? So we'll have a conversation about that as well. So it has been a very instructive project from the beginning, honestly. And then, and I'm not going to, the details, I'm just reminding you of what we're doing, and Scott, Steve, and Lisa are really going to dive in with you for the rest of the morning. I'm just here to set the tone and the background. The project team, this is slightly more readable than Craig's slide. Yay. A lot of people have participated in this, providing technical input, reviews, advice, or doing some of the nitty-gritty work and analyses that occur. And I didn't acknowledge our funders. Craig referenced the National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative. It's a mouthful, but a fantastic funding source for these kinds of projects. Also, the Wildlife Forever Fund chipped in a little bit of money to help as well, and that came through Restore America's Estuaries, so I like to shout them out. And I just want to end my part of this, and I'm happy to do questions if you want about the bigger picture, but I think questions about the actual feasibility work, we'll let these guys get started and get into the weeds with you. But I just want to end my part of this and just say, this is really exciting stuff. This is the place to be right now. We've now got a pretty good understanding of and it sounds obvious, what we know and what we don't know, and what we can do with that information from a carbon finance perspective, from a carbon management perspective, in 3 places in the Northwest that we didn't have before. And so I find that absolutely just great. It's really great stuff. So with that, I will stop. Any questions before I hand it off to, who's starting, Lisa? Okay, before I hand it off to Lisa. All right, thank you. Where'd it go? Mouse went away. It's a disappearing mouse. There it is.
Well, good morning. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces in here from our last workshop from back in January, and also to see some new faces. My name is Lisa Schile-Beers. I've been working on the technical side of this project, collating all of the data that we can come across and synthesizing it in a way where I could hand it off to Scott Settlemyer to get a sense for if we would have the potential for carbon offsets within the Pacific Northwest in our example scenarios. And then also trying to identify our data needs and data gaps that would make this analysis a bit stronger. So you've seen this slide a couple times already, but basically we were trying to, wait, is this the right? I don't think this is my right presentation. Trying to assess the feasibility of using carbon offsets for financing. Where is this? There we go. All right, so we were looking at the feasibility of connecting carbon finance to restoration in the Pacific Northwest, and seeing if there was the potential that, with restoration, it is awfully expensive to implement. And so if there's other avenues to be able to supplement some of the costs for these projects. And so what I'm going to present today is I'm going to review some select sites within the estuaries so that we could get a sense for what a carbon project would look like. We specifically chose not to choose specific sites within the estuaries that we were working in, but instead just giving some examples of what it could look like. I'm going to present some initial estimates of what we came across, our results, and then also highlight the potential for carbon offsets. And I just want to highlight that within a carbon project, you have a baseline scenario. So this is basically what the site looks like before any sort of restoration or any project activity occurs. So this could be a pasture land, agricultural land, and should also note that it can't be in use for at least 2 years prior to a carbon project from happening. And then with the project scenario, this is once the restoration has actually occurred. And we're interested in plant biomass, so both above ground for herbaceous plants and total tree biomass when you're talking about trees and also shrubs. We are interested in soil carbon accumulation and also trace gas emissions such as methane and nitrous oxide. And ultimately, you would assume that with any sort of project activity that you would have more greenhouse gas removals than you would with the baseline, so that with your project activity, you'd be sequestering more carbon. And it could be that your baseline is degrading, but then with your project activity, it's increasing, or there's a couple different scenarios. But you want to see the, some sort of increase in carbon storage with your project activities. Otherwise, you're not, you wouldn't be getting any offsets. Oh, I seem to have added the wrong file onto this computer. So 1 second, I'll just keep talking. So we started off in the Snohomish. And within the Snohomish, we had identified pretty early on that there was agricultural activity that was going on. There was the potential for restoration. And in all of the systems that we're focusing on, they're definitely riverine-dominated systems. So there's more opportunity for restoration within oligohaline and mesohaline sites. So there's the potential for more methane emissions to be occurring. There is the potential for some restoration within polyhaline sites, but that was not, there weren't that many options for that. So we were focusing in areas that predominantly, so it was formerly agriculture, and there's, we were surprised to find that reed canary grass was found at a lot of these sites, and we didn't really know that much about it going into it, like what was its biomass? Does it have the potential to accumulate soil carbon? So that was one of our big surprises and also one of our big unknowns, that there could definitely be a lot more data collected within that realm that would help support our results and feeding into the carbon projects. All right, I'm sorry, you guys. I am just about to get this saved.
So while Lisa's doing that, who wants to define salinity ranges of polyhaline and oligohaline? Jude?
Freshwater less than 0.5 PSU practical salinity units used to be called parts per thousand. Oligohaline, 7 and below, 5 and below. I mean, you're asking maybe the wrong person, but I'll put it out there. Okay, so 5 and below, this is You just want to be the broker that
Because you're local.
How about the lead policy city?
Let the local people shine.
Right.
All right, sorry about that. So I wanted just to highlight the illustrative examples that we're using across the 3 estuaries that we were focusing in. And this is a little bit blurry, but like I was saying earlier, our baselines are either former agriculture or former pasture land. So it would be seasonally wet with fresh water. You would have low herbaceous biomass in the case of what we were seeing in the Skagit. And then with the project condition, in this particular scenario, it would be restored to a mesohaline tidal wetland. So this is from about 5 to 18 parts per thousand. It's lower, it's brackish, but not completely a salt marsh. And we're thinking the vegetation community would be common 3 square and bulrush. You would have some methane emissions, but it wouldn't be as large as it would be compared to freshwater marsh. In our next scenario, and this would apply to the Skagit Delta as well, it would be former agriculture in the baseline setting. Again, seasonally wet with fresh water, some low herbaceous biomass, low to no soil carbon accumulation, although we don't have the data quite to support that. It's just our hunch based off of the literature review. And then with the project scenario, it would be an oligohaline tidal marsh. So this is a low salinity marsh from about 0.5 to 5. And it would be covered in Lyngby sedge, at least in the initial stages. Over time, we're only looking at a 40-year time frame within these feasibility assessments, carbon feasibility assessments. So there's definitely going to be changes in the plant cover over time. And then we would also have moderate methane emissions, moderate to high. In another scenario that we examined, and this is more applicable for here in the Snohomish and then also in Coos estuary, you would have a former pasture. Again, it would be seasonally wet with fresh water. And then we've found in a lot of the sites that we visited and also with our end user engagement with you, that it's dominated by reed canary grass. And we'll be talking about this in more detail and also hopefully solicit some more feedback and information from you. And then within the project scenario, we would have, again, it would be an oligohaline, so it's lower salinity marsh, and it would be covered by Lyngby sedge, at least initially, and then moderate methane emissions. Our second to last scenario is, again, a former pasture, like what you would find here within the Snohomish. Again, seasonally wet, dominated by reed canary grass. And then our project scenario would be a freshwater tidal wetland. And again, I'm having it initially getting colonized by the Lyngby sedge, but that would pretty quickly get outcompeted by other species, but just for simplicity's sake in this project, including the Lyngby sedge. And then our final scenario that we addressed is what if you were to restore Sitka spruce, so forested tidal wetlands, and how might that affect the carbon sequestration? And then also we tried 2 different scenarios with 1/3 cover and 2/3 covers of the trees, just looking at imagery of the sites, the still intact sites in the Snohomish, and seeing if that would have any impact on the offset generation. So just to start off with our key findings right from the get-go, most of the scenarios that we examined did not result in the creation of carbon offsets. So that meant that there was not as much carbon being sequestered within the project scenario than compared to the baseline. And this is largely due to methane, that since the estuaries that we're focusing in up here are river dominated, there's more of a freshwater input and then the greater potential for methane emissions. And this is larger than the carbon that's getting accumulated within the soil and also the biomass. But there is one exception to this, and that it appears that when you do restore the Sitka spruce, that there is enough carbon stored within the trees above and below ground that you do get the creation of carbon offsets through this. And I'll go into this a lot more, but just wanted to say from the very get-go what our key findings were. And then also the reed canary grass, that this is definitely a big unknown and that we need more research into this to see. It appears, the data seem to suggest that there is soil carbon accumulation even in non-tidal situations with this plant. And we don't really have a sense for what the methane emissions are with this plant as well. So we definitely need some more support, some more research into how this plant affects both soil carbon dynamics and greenhouse gas emissions. So just to dig in a little bit deeper into the Snohomish, so this is an example of what the estuary used to look like before massive human changes. So it was some tidal salt marshes and brackish marshes up near the mouth, but it was predominantly forested wetlands, so the Sitka spruce throughout the estuary. And currently, as we see now, it's been highly impacted, both between pasture lands, agriculture, urban development. But there's also a lot of potential, has been highlighted before, for restoration. There's already a lot of restoration that's ongoing and planned, so there is the potential for carbon projects to occur in this estuary, more so than the other ones that we have examined. And so what I was saying, in our baseline scenarios, we're assuming that it is an abandoned or inactive pasture land or agriculture, and it has to have been abandoned for at least 2 years for a carbon project to be applicable. We are assuming that there is some sort of minimal soil carbon accumulation, and we're going with 1 ton of carbon per hectare, which is pretty modest. Like I said, they're seasonally flooded with fresh water, so there is the potential for methane emissions to occur. And we were going off of methane data collected by Scott Bridgham's student in Oregon. He collected his methane and nitrous oxide data in a couple of different estuaries, but to our knowledge, we don't have local data to be able to incorporate into this analysis. So we're just going off of the best data that we have regionally applicable. Like I mentioned, with the reed canary grass, it's a non-native invasive grass species, forms monospecific stands, highly productive, and we are led to believe that there is soil carbon accumulation that is occurring within these sites, wherever this plant is present.
What's the source of
With Laura Brophy's data, and then also there was cores that were collected by John Ribzik at Paloot. And so one of our with project scenarios is the herbaceous tidal freshwater wetlands. So this is no salinity, dominated by Lingby sedge. We used the soil carbon accumulation rates from North Eby Island, so right here within the Snohomish. One thing that you have to account for within the carbon projects is the amount of carbon that is coming in from outside of the site. So the allochthonous carbon, this is carbon that was produced elsewhere. It is attached to sediment, but then it actually gets buried within a site. And so we have to make a deduction for this, because even though it is getting sequestered within the soil, that doesn't count as being produced as a result of a project activity. So based off of soil core data, we make an estimate that about 30% of the soil carbon coming in is produced outside of the estuary or outside of that site. And then again, we were using methane and nitrous oxide data from coastal Oregon estuaries from natural sites. Very similar scenario for looking at a mesohaline site. similar soil or the same soil carbon accumulation rates, the same plant species initially dominating, and similar methane and nitrous oxide. And then investigating with the Sitka spruce, we only specifically looked at a freshwater tidal restoration with the Sitka spruce, even though we know it can tolerate higher salinities. And we are assuming that the tree coverage is either 1/3 or 2/3. And one of the assumptions that we were making as well when it came to the biomass for the Sitka spruce is that we were using growth curves that may not have been may not have included tidal forests for the Sitka spruce. It could be upland. So this could be slight overestimate in the values that we're putting in, but still it is our best guess at what the carbon storage would be within above and below ground. And we calculated what the carbon storage would be over a 40-year project period. So I'm showing the cumulative values in CO2 equivalents. Again, we use the soil carbon accretion rate from North Eby Island, and then based off of other soil core data within forested swamps, the percent allochthonous carbon is a bit lower, only 24% compared to it was higher, it was like 37%. Mm-hmm.
Microphone. Can you guys pass the microphone up? Thank you.
Okay, the question is, are you also calculating an allochthonous carbon deduction in the baseline scenario with the reed canary grass?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just hadn't seen it on the slides before, so. Okay.
Yes, we are calculating a slight deduction for allochthonous carbon, because sometimes when there is a storm and water breaches over the levees, or if you have a leaky tidal gate, there is some sediment that is coming into the systems, but it's not as regular as if it's normally tidally influenced site. Next, I'm going to work through what our summary, our results for each of our scenarios. So starting up at the top, we do a summary of the baseline soil removals or emissions. And I should note that this is incorporating soil carbon accumulation, methane emissions, and nitrous oxide emissions. So everything is lumped into that one value. So we're doing that for baseline, for project. This next line is the difference between the two. We have our either emissions or reductions from the biomass. Our net emissions reductions, so that's the sum of the biomass and the soils. Non-permanence buffer, and this is the deduction that occurs. Scott, would you mention real quickly what that is, what the non-permanence buffer? It's a deduction.
So yeah, the non-permanence buffer is a deduction or a contribution to a buffer pool at the carbon standard that's held in the registry there. It's to protect against possible reversals. It's more easily thought of when you're thinking about maybe the Sitka spruce example, that you have trees that have removed carbon from the atmosphere, but there could be an event that where the trees die off and the carbon's released back in the atmosphere. And so this idea that there could be potential reversals is addressed through this contribution to this overall buffer pool, which protects projects and any projects in the land use sector from this type of risk, so that the buyer knows when they buy this credit that it's a permanent reduction, and if there's a reversal, that there's a set aside that's been established to cover that risk.
Well, thank you, Scott. And then our final row is what the total carbon offsets would be taken into consideration, the baseline removals, and also your project removals. And then across the top, these are all the different scenarios that I just discussed in the previous slides. So starting with the tidal freshwater wetland, we are seeing that in the baseline there are actually removals that are occurring. So a positive value means that it's carbon removals. Values in parentheses meaning that there are emissions. And ultimately what we're finding is that with the net emissions reductions, that there's more emissions that are occurring with the project than there are in the baseline, and this is largely due to the methane emissions. This was not necessarily what we were hoping to see or expecting to see, but just given the data that we have, our findings. So as a result, there are no carbon offsets that are produced with this scenario. Find to a similar degree with the tidal mesohaline wetlands, so this is a slightly more saline site. Still, the emissions removals with the baseline are greater than with project because of the methane emissions. So in the end, there are no carbon offsets generated. On a much more positive note, with the incorporation of Sitka spruce in a restoration site, there's ultimately, there are more emissions reductions with the project than with the baseline, and so carbon offsets are generated, and these values are much greater when you have greater coverage of the trees within your site. There's a lot of caveats that can go into this, that it's harder to do tidal forested restoration. You have to have the elevations right, you have to have the hydrology correct. You may have to invest more money initially into the project for planting, but there is the potential for carbon offset generation through this scenario.
Maybe we should pause and just have a little conversation.
Sure.
About this slide.
While we're pausing, can I just add just a clarification? And I think you mentioned this earlier, but the data here represents an illustrative project that's 100 hectares in size, and Lisa mentioned this, but over a 40-year time horizon. So that's the cumulative results over 40 years.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And I think, is this on? So it's worth going again through the data that went into this and how it feeds through into this calculation, because of course the numbers they get out depends upon the data, and there's still a lot of data sparsity in this area. So the two things that have changed since we thought about this previously, one is an estimate of carbon accumulation rate in the baseline. And what we're finding within the Snohomish particularly, it's different to the Skagit, at least I'll come to the Skagit. We're starting with a system which is effectively already a wetland. We have these wet pasture soils, and they're accumulating carbon already. And the question is, how much carbon are they accumulating? And really the data that we have is coming from somewhere else, and we don't have a lot of data from somewhere else. So there's an open question right there. But the data we do have is suggesting that these wet pasture lands are actually accumulating quite a lot of carbon already. So if you've gone from an agricultural field which was not having much carbon, and you just went to that interim phase of a wet grassland area, wet pasture, you've started a lot of carbon accumulation at that point. The other variable which is very important, as Lisa's been mentioning, is the methane emissions. When we look at this site, when we look at the Snohomish from, say, a national classification, a lot of this wet pasture land is recognized as palustrine wetlands, which would have quite a high methane value associated with that. The numbers we're getting for the methane come from Scott Bridgham's group's work in Oregon, where they've been looking again at these wet pasture lands, and they have a lower methane emission, at least measured on those sites, than we might find on a restored wetland. So the methane emissions are going up from one, but we're getting a carbon accumulation rate within the baseline condition here, which would be different if we were starting with, say, a potato field. So these are some of the really interesting things that we're drawing out. But we're also recognizing, we'll come back to this later, we've got some really big data gaps here. So our data has improved from last time, particularly related to methane and soil carbon accumulation rates, but it's still really sparse.
I have a couple questions. The first one, in relating to that, to your comments that you just made, I'm wondering if there is a native grass that just doesn't exist in these estuaries anymore because they're either agricultural or they're invasive. And specifically, I'm thinking about the work of the Ketchmack Bay Research Reserve and their work on headwater streams, but in the wetlands surrounding these headwater streams, it's all blue joint. It's Calamagrostis canadensis. And they did some work comparing that to the reed canary grass and to see if it serves a different niche, if it's really in a different niche or not. Because there's some reed canary grass on the Kenai Peninsula, but mostly it's the native blue joint. And so I'm just wondering if that can be brought into the equation, although I don't know what the native grass would be here. So, and then I have another question that you can add on to it, or you can answer it when you're ready, is how sea level rise, have you taken into account how sea level rise might affect these numbers as the salinity changes as you go into the estuary, as sea level rise progresses into the estuary?
These are good questions. Scott.
The quick question to the last answer is no, we've not, at this stage, this sort of early feasibility stage, incorporated any sea level rise modeling into the estimates. But it is, project does go forward, it is a requirement of the methodology to do sea level rise modeling to see how it affects the baseline as well as your project scenario. So, and I think I'll let someone else maybe comment on the native grass. Yeah, the idea with the sea level rise, there's sort of two aspects of that. One is areas that are going to be submerged in your project. The guidance is to consider maybe removing them from the project because they may not have a permanent benefit. But it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that. We're finding in some of the other projects that we've worked on that Steve referenced that sea level rise can also, it can affect groundwater tables before you get inundation. And then that change in groundwater table could change the vegetation, which could then change the greenhouse gas balance in your baseline. So it's a little bit, and I think that sometimes goes beyond what SLAM is intended for. SLAM is to model inundation. So, for instance, the Herring River, there's some more efforts going on to model impact on groundwater levels resulting from sea level rise, and then predicting changes in vegetation that occur as well. So it's complicated.
Yeah. Just to add to that, I think we did include a little bit in the report, but not in the analysis, that with rising groundwater levels, those wet pastures will become wetter, and then methane emissions will likely increase. So I think we mentioned it, but we didn't have a quantification for that. And, well, the change in salinity is an interesting one, and we didn't factor that in, unfortunately. Sort of arm waving a little bit right now, and I would suspect the salinity might not change that much in the Snohomish because it's a confined system with a very strong river flow. And when you look at the historic condition, it was freshwater tidal forest and then emergent marshes at the edge. Now, in the Skagit, the system is quite different from what it used to be historically. It was this enormous expanse of delta, and now the wetlands where the restoration's taking place is confined to these very narrow strip right next to the existing channels. And so all the freshwater flow is really confined, and it's right next to where the restoration projects are. But if there was a situation, I know that the people in the Skagit don't want this situation, they're very pro-agriculture there, but if that system was reverted back to what it was historically, that freshwater flow would be dispersed much more across the landscape, and we probably have areas with more saline wetlands within the delta. So the restorations there are we're kind of forcing it towards a very fresh condition, which it wouldn't be if we had bigger restoration across the landscape there, potentially. But there's a lot of arm waving there, and it's not necessarily what the people want in the Skagit system.
Can I just add onto that as well on the salinity question and how it could change? I mean, I think we still are uncertain about how current salinity, how that affects methane emissions in these systems. I think Lisa mentioned that and has some data, some analysis that we did as well to show how the greenhouse gas fluxes and the offset generation changes based on the methane emissions. And in these sort of lower salinity systems, you have a lot of variability that in some of the data that has been collected, where you have sometimes high methane emissions, sometimes low methane emissions. On average, we've modeled that out here, but there's still a lot of open question as to what it is today that I think needs some further research as well.
I actually have 3 questions. An easy one, the 1/3 and 2/3, is that measured by stem density or actual cover?
It was just looking off of aerial imagery.
So canopy cover. Okay, thanks.
Canopy.
And then I'm wondering, I'm sure this is a methods thing, but why is it a 40-year? I thought that a lot of modeling has shown that the tidal wetlands kind of turn over to sink functions after a few 100 or 300 years. So what's the reason for the 40-year timeline?
We'll just stand up here with me.
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, that's for the finance feasibility study. That was a more, I guess maybe a more relevant time frame to look at what sort of funding could be provided to help cover costs over the more near term. So it was more this sort of finance timeline than the long-term ecological timeline.
Would it be possible to add a long-term scenario?
Well, it could be, but for carbon offsets, the maximum crediting life for a project is 100 years. We looked at a 40-year time frame. That could be renewed. So you could extend out to 100 years, but when you're doing the financial analysis today and you look at the value of those future benefits out in year 50 or 60 in terms of the impact in terms of today's dollar, it becomes smaller and smaller. So, sort of the most of the value you're getting in today's dollars is in that first 40 years.
My final question concerns the allochthonous material. And I'm very interested in fluxes between coastal ecosystems. And I understand that the terrestrial systems have their own, are getting their own credit, like the forested systems and the upland systems. But I'm wondering, basically in terms of the overall methods, why there isn't sort of an export term, a lowering, a deduction from those terrestrial systems, because in fact the material is being exported from the terrestrial systems and the function of the marshes is to capture it. So without the marshes it would not be getting captured and sequestered, because that's a very large term. I mean, you're talking about the methane really being the big contributor, but 37.2% is a pretty large term.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you on that. And the VCS guidelines are extremely rigorous and extremely, I would say, restrictive in some estimates. They're trying to be more on the conservative side on things. So I was surprised too when I saw such a strong deduction for that. But it's been based off of, there's a paper 2018 by Needleman. They're trying to come up with a way of estimating of what this deduction would be, just given soil core data, like what the % carbon is within a natural site. It's based off of other field measurements, but there was an equation that they used that has been incorporated into the VCS methodology. But it's very, very restrictive.
And just to add to that, then I'll give the microphone to Ron. It's one of the data gaps that we have that would be very helpful to fill is if we can quantify the difference in the fate of that allochthonous carbon. So if that allochthonous carbon was going to be remineralized once it gets down to the mudflat, but the presence of the wetland is preventing that from going back to the atmosphere, then we should capture that as a credit. So we're being very conservative with this assumption, And because of the data gap, that's the way we are pushed to be within the methodology. But if we can improve upon that, then we can recognize it.
Okay, well, Haida scooped me and Scott helped. And anyway, but yeah, I mean Steve. But yeah, the material, a lot, it gets moved off of a site, goes someplace else, and there's a fate of what goes on with that. It can go deep and get buried deep, or it can be remineralized along the way. I think it's really a big gap in this whole thing. As you guys, it sounds like you're interested in that, and you know, something like Padilla Bay. I mean, you have 3,000 hectares of eelgrass, and a lot of it goes. I mean, it produces, and then a lot of it. I mean, not a lot of it ends up higher up. It goes deep, and we really have no idea what's going on there. And so I think that's a big gap in, you know, what happens, the fate of the produced carbon plant material.
So my question was around baseline, and so your baseline is the estimate based on limited data. So when you actually would go forward with the project, you'd have to, what would you have to do to establish the baseline, and of course the changing water table levels and such, how would the monitoring plan, how would you be able to respond, and what does the methodology say about what kind of data you need for the baseline? Can you model it, or, and so I'm thinking, would you have an estuary and then an unaffected area that would be like a baseline you can monitor over time as it changes? How would that work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that the methodology has different options for how you estimate greenhouse gas fluxes in the baseline. And it runs from, you know, using default values in some cases, literature values. You can model it. There are proxy site options as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you estimate those changes. And as I mentioned before, sea level rise is something that you're supposed to incorporate into that. There's not, you know, terribly specific guidance on how you do that. So I think, you know, that's maybe left up to the discretion of the project developer to build that into those models at the baseline as best as possible.
No, I think this is a real data gap, and particularly related to methane emissions and water table, and how we'd measure that. You know, we're getting a handle around the carbon stock changes, but for the methane emissions, I think we've only got Scott's data for like a couple of locations down in the Scott Bridgem, that is, down in Oregon, and that's pretty much it. So, you know, it's a real hole in terms of data is the methane and water management here.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, and particularly, you know, this was back to the use of default values. So when we have, you know, salinity above 18, there's default values in the methodology that allow you to assume sort of low levels of methane. But below that, we can't use default values, and we've seen not just here in the Pacific Northwest, but everywhere that's sort of a big data gap, and it's not something that's easily, you know, unlike sort of maybe some methods for looking at soil carbon, you can't sort of go back and look at what the emissions were of methane after the fact. You can only measure them going forward, and often you need more than just a single year of data to establish what would be the baseline, because there's a lot of sort of climate dependent variables. So that is in the need. There is a big need everywhere for more data, more research data on methane that extends over at least a couple years or longer.
One thing I wanted to mention, if we in the future are going to be looking at the question of salinity and how that changes in the future, I think at least for Cascade rivers to really think about summer flows as a really key part of that. Research I've done in the Stille and some modeling, Stille and Skagit and others, is that
the summer flows change the salinity a lot during the growing season of the tidal marshes. In 2015, for example, super low river flows that are thought to be typical of what we might see several decades in the future. And we saw poor water salinities throughout the estuary that were at least a minimum of 2, sometimes 3 times higher than poor water salinities in other normal years. So I think in the analyses I've done, at least in the Cascade River systems, the potential effect over the next several decades of changes in summer river flows is going to be much bigger on the estuary tidal marshes than the effect of sea level rise during that time period.
Finding the dialogue super interesting, and kind of feeling like the take-home point is there's a large data gap in what's going on here. As we go through the day and looking at those 4 columns, the take-home message for a restoration ecologist at this point is it's not really worth investing into carbon funding potential market if you're doing more or less non-forested restoration. And if that's true, as we kind of go up to that, I'd love to hear more of that, focus on some restoration ecologists, the projects going on around here, from use blue carbon as a funding source to offset some things, what projects does it actually work?
I'm going to respond to that one. I would say, I'll say you, Boone. And yes, I think I've talked to a few people here, and there's interest in restoring some of the forested tidal wetlands, and that's not been a focus up until now. It's been a lot of really great emergent wetlands restoration, which has been taking place. And so, while the news is looking sad for financing through carbon the emergent wetlands in these brackish conditions, it's looking positive on the forested tidal wetlands, at least if you can take it to a bigger scale than 100 hectares. And so, from that side, it might be an additional stimulus for getting some wetlands restored that have been difficult to get restored up until now. So, the forested tidal wetlands. That's that one. Boone.
Yeah, just these numbers are based on 100 hectare size.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it? Okay, yeah, because it's really. It'd be interesting to use the actual data that's been collected to see how of the particularly the tidal wetland, see how the data would come in. And I think a lot of this is just maybe we not only lack baseline data, but I think we could do a better job of analysis too. We don't have all the numbers up there. For example, if you're restoring wetlands from pasture, it seems to me we're not doing an entire life cycle analysis. You're not eliminating the 2 tons of carbon, methane, CO2 equivalent from methane from the livestock, the 1 ton CO2 equivalent of nitrous oxide from the livestock. I think the numbers might change quite dramatically if you did an entire life cycle analysis instead of just carbon sequestration. And then finally, in terms of methane, are you modeling your numbers based on pore water salinity data or surface water salinity data? Because that would have a huge difference as well, in that pore water salinity is typically much higher and would therefore give you, which is why we quite often see lower than expected methane emissions.
I will have to follow up with you on whether, I believe it was pore water salinity that Scott Bridgham's student was collecting, but I don't know what depth it was collected, but I have that paper here that I can look at that.
There was pore water surface, so probably in the top 20 to 30 centimeters.
Okay. So it was top 20 to 30 centimeters for the pore water.
It'd be interesting to see where the methanogens are producing methane in too as well. Maybe much, much deeper than that.
And then also addressing your first question when it comes to the full, the life cycle of the sites. When factoring in the baseline emissions, there can't be any leakage, I would just say, for the project activity. So we can't be displacing, say, an active pasture land or active agriculture for a carbon project. So we're modeling things as if there aren't the cows on the property. You're not adding the nitrogen for the fertilizers. So it's basically, you've got to consider the field just being abandoned or in abandoned state and what that would be like over the certain amount of time. But that was one question that I had too when I started up on this project too. So, well, why aren't we factoring in methane emissions from the cows and such and fertilizer application? But that's not part of the methodology. Sure.
From ag land or pasture land into restored lands, and if we're, two different ways of calculating sequestration. The VM7 is all about conserving lands and restoring, so those two pieces. So I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about why that's not being factored in, because that would be part of how something like this would actually happen in practice. Because if we're going to create the space to do blue carbon sequestration at the scale that we need to do it, then we have to be reclaiming lands, and we may not be able to wait for them to sit before you move into going into restoration. So it'd be interesting to, I'd just like to hear a little bit about that.
I can comment on that. The simple answer is that, Lisa mentioned leakage. In the concept of carbon accounting, this is the idea that your project activity could displace other activities occurring on the landscape to another place outside of your project area. All right. So the idea is that in the land use sector, that could mean that you have an active farm or an active pasture. You restore that, but then that goes somewhere else on the landscape, and maybe other land is cleared and other emissions occur as that gets relocated. So the idea and the methodology is to say, and that's hard to account for. So the idea is to say, hey, there are instances, it's easier to account for instances where that land is not being used for something productive at the moment that could be displaced elsewhere, which is harder to account for.
And just to add to this also, because I think this point is very good, and having been part of the team that wrote the methodology, this was a lot of discussion. And I think, yes, when we've also developed these scenarios, we've used this west pasture land as being one of the dominant baseline conditions for a couple of reasons. One, there was a lot of that already in the Homish. But when we had the discussions with the folks in the Skagit, where there's not a lot of this, there's a lot of ag, potato fields, which is being completely nuked of carbon. And they were very sensitive to the idea of ag land to be converted to wetlands. It was a very difficult discussion in the Skagit system as compared to here. And so where we would have been looking, we've been much more enthusiastic if we had at looking at a scenario, and we have a sensitivity analysis, so we can look at some of the implications of this. We would be much more enthusiastic about looking at, because if you want to go from large-scale ag to wetlands restoration, we would use a different type of baseline for that, which should be that type of project.
Yeah, and I guess I think we're selling ourselves short a little bit, because there are farmers who would do this on part of their lands. Yeah. And so I think it's not necessarily, I think saying it's going to displace, yes, it could, but I think there would be instances in which it wouldn't be fully displacing something, but it would be built into the way that they're handling their buffers. And so I think there are other ways to think about it. And it may not be a 100-hectare project, but it may be expanding the buffers that they have already on their lands. And so I think there could be a way to bring it in that's taking into account leakage.
Yeah. So one of your project activities could be going from, say, potato field to wet pasture to wetlands restoration. So that interim, which we're using as a baseline right now, would actually be the initiation of your project from your, say, potato to grassland to wetland. And we mentioned this in the text as being one of the potential activities. But yes, so generally, yes, I agree with your point.
Is there a discount rate for leakage in VM7 or 33? Not like a forestry project that you would just kind of estimate we're going to do logging elsewhere, so we discount 20%. We don't have that here.
In the methodologies, both of them, it's just a 2-year, the land can't have been used for another activity in those 2 years. and which is problematic as you're raising, rightly so. And the methodology team might want to take a look at that again and see if there's something we can do.
Dairy cattle or whatever land use is going to be offset somewhere else is if you did that forestry, there wouldn't be a single forest project in the world because you couldn't do forestry. I mean, you save forestry. No, absolutely, but not 100%.
No, yeah, there's not a full-out exclusion, and I think the difference is that there's maybe more data and more analysis that's in the people can estimate it in a better way. So it's possible. It's hard.
I just wanted to ask a question, I guess, about initial conditions. And you're working in ag land or pasture land, and expecting it to change and sequester carbon, and it's already sequestering carbon. What about, basically sand or inorganic material? I mean, there's creation projects. There's excavation, like in Emmett-Mattox Bay, where it's basically all gone, but you excavate down, you basically get to, inorganic material, and you can plant plants in there. And for a while, anyway, you're probably going to sequester carbon as the below ground builds up. You're going to have a net sequestration. Those kinds of scenarios might be more available in some places than others, but I think initial conditions could be considered. These kind of, when these sites, of course, subside when they're behind levees. The wetlands subside, and you can get a pulse of inorganic sediment that would come in and cover a big area. That could be an initial condition there in that situation.
I'll just make one last point before Lisa keeps us going. Maybe I'll just say this later, but the assumption that's in there about the wet pasture is, from the limited data there is, we're assuming that the carbon continues to accrete. Now, is that really the case? Will it just saturate at some point? 20, 40 years out, does that carbon accumulation rate just equal emissions? And so in which case it would be a net zero. But because we're working in this 40-year time frame, the assumption is that the wet grassland continues to accumulate carbon at that point. So that's definitely, we'll come back to this as research needs. That might be a gross over assumption about the amount of carbon accumulation that occurs within these wet soils.
I have one quick question. When does the bulk of the carbon offset generation happen in the restoration projects with the forestry? Does that not occur until like year 10 or? Yeah.
With the data, tree growth is, thanks. The tree growth is overcoming the increase in methane emissions. But that tree growth, like most trees, it's sort of an S-shaped curve, so it's a little bit slower at the front end, and sort of the middle part of that is where it starts to accrue the most carbon. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for that. That was extremely useful dialogue that's going on. I did want to highlight, though, that with all of these key uncertainties that we're talking about with the baseline soil carbon sequestration rates, and then also with project methane emissions, we did conduct a sensitivity analysis just to get a sense for, given the range of baseline soil carbon accumulation and project scenarios, like where would you end up finding a sweet spot where there could be offset generation. So in this particular situation where we're talking about a tidal freshwater wetland, if you're assuming, this is like your best case scenario right here, where there's no baseline soil carbon accumulation, and your methane is minimal, like extremely minimal. So then you would actually get quite a bit of offset generation. But as you see, the higher that your project soil methane emissions go up, the less offsets you would get, and then the same with as your baseline soil carbon accumulation increases, the fewer offsets you would get. And we did this analysis for all of the different scenarios that we presented. So a little bit more optimistic when you have, when you're restoring to a more saline brackish marsh. Again, you have, this is your sweet spot here where there's no baseline soil carbon accumulation and very minimal with project methane emissions. And once you get into the project scenarios where you have the trees, the Sitka spruce, the generation is across a higher range of salinity levels and then baseline soil carbon accumulation rates. It is more optimistic. And this is when we're considering 2/3 coverage. So there is the potential, and you are seeing that if you, we're kind of playing around a little bit with what the impact of each of these variables are into this analysis, and as you can see, it's a pretty stark, I mean, it's non-insignificant. And I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop because the rest is with Skagit and other sites, and we have our break at 10:30, unless people have.
Would folks be able to see the Skagit as a comparison?
Okay. Okay. So another site that we were looking at is the Skagit Delta, and so the river comes through down here. It used to historically, all of this was wetland in some form or fashion, and based on what you were saying earlier about looking at the salinities. So this is a salinity map during the summer on, it's a low tide water flow that basically it's all fresh water up within the river system. It's barely brackish along the edges. So when we're looking at a system and just looking at the salinity distribution, and granted this is just a point in time, that all these systems are pretty freshwater influenced.
You said that is a low during summer?
So this would be where, at least within this modeling scenario, where you would have the highest salinities.
When you want a high then, it's all the way pushed up into the river, all the way up to the maximum at a low low?
Oh, you are correct. Yes, it is the high, but during the
Low river flows out high tide going in.
correct. Yes, you nailed it. So within this one particular analysis, this is just what would the maximum salinities look like within this area and this snapshot in time. And so where the wetlands are along the edge, it is still within this setup pretty freshwater compared to, so probably higher chances for the methane production. Within our baseline scenario, we're assuming that it is abandoned agricultural land, again, seasonally flooded with fresh water. Instead of having the reed canary grass, it's dominated by short-statured grasses. And again, we're using methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions from degraded pasture lands or degraded wetland sites within Oregon. So that's our closest data sources that we have. Within the scenarios that we examined with the project, again, we're looking at low salinity sites. We're assuming that it's initially going to be colonized by Lingby sedge, but this will likely get outcompeted over time by other species. Again, it's a pretty high deduction for the allochthonous carbon because this is a very mineral-rich system. There is a lot of sediment that's transported down the river, so there's, as a result, a high deduction for that. And again, we're using the methane and nitrous oxide emissions from natural sites in Oregon, or tidal sites within Oregon of comparable salinity range. And our other example is looking at a more saline system, but again, it's the same scenarios, the same data inputs that we're putting in. We didn't have any soil carbon accumulation rates within the Skagit, so we're using the values from the Snohomish. And what we're seeing looking at the carbon offset generation, that in both of these scenarios, we're not seeing any offset generation, that the methane production is greater than the soil carbon accumulation and the plant biomass. Oops. And again, looking at the sensitivity analysis with looking at baseline soil carbon accumulation rates and project soil methane emissions, the sweet spot here. But there are fewer opportunities for offset generation, both within the oligohaline and slightly more optimistic with a slightly more saline wetland. And that is for our main conclusions. So as you can see that there are great uncertainties with our methane and nitrous oxide emissions, that we definitely need more research endeavors going into not only what these emissions are within natural wetland sites, but restored sites and degraded sites of various types. Looking into what that is both under like a baseline condition, what if there was an abandoned pasture land or an abandoned agricultural land, like what are these emissions? And we don't have that much data. I was really grateful to have Scott Bridgham's students' data, just something that was remotely regionally collected that we can apply instead of just using defaults from the literature, which I would think would be a little bit more hand-waving than what we are doing here. We need a lot more data when it comes to soil carbon accumulation rates within restoring sites, natural sites, and degraded sites so that we can pinpoint more what is happening in our baseline conditions. Like, is it happening that the reed canary grass is sequestering carbon with minimal water, like minimal tidal activity, just a leaky tide gate? Is that enough just to promote carbon storage? We don't really have that information, and we don't have a sense for how much methane is being emitted as a conduit through the reed canary grass as well. So there's some definitely some key uncertainties, and hopefully within this conversation here and then this afternoon that we can get some more ideas, some more energy going to try to answer some of these research needs so that we can be more on target with our projections within these carbon financing projects. All right, and with that, it is 10:30 and time for coffee break, snacks, stretch your legs.
Okay, sounds good. Let's reconvene at 10:45. Sounds good.
I hate Dropbox and selective sync.